Hey, it's Lee Halliday, and this video is all about forms in React. We'll be using React Hook Form to help us build a user registration form where we'll ask for name, email, password. You must agree to some terms. We'll do some validations on that, submit it to a server so that we can handle any errors that the server might respond to us with. And we'll also add some tests to make sure that it's showing the validation errors as expected. Packages like this are sort of a necessity in React, although you can do it vanilla yourself, but there's a lot of things to take care of, such as getting the user input, applying the validations, storing the errors somewhere and displaying them to the user, handling submission. So there's a reason why React Hook Form, or Formic is another package you can use to make forms a little bit easier, exist. So this is what we're dealing with, this beautiful I'm Your form. It's a Next.js application, and if we pop over here, it's just got this one page going on, index, our home page. So this is our functional component, the home component, and I've already installed React Hook Form, and I've already imported the useForm hook that we'll be working with. So that's how we get started. We say const is equal to useForm, and what this gives us back is a function called register. And register is used to basically tie your input elements back to this useForm hook. So before we even move further, we've got the TSX going on. So we're doing TypeScript, and I can pass some additional information about what fields we'll be collecting in this form. So we'll call this the form data interface that we'll define up here. Interface form data. And this is where we just say which fields we're collecting and what types of data they've got. So we've got name, which is a string, email, string, password, string, and our last one will be terms, which is a Boolean, like that. I'd like to take a minute to talk about AppSignal, who has partnered with me on this video. I was excited to partner with them because I've used them professionally on multiple websites, and what it is an all-in-one monitoring tool that gives you detailed insight into what your users are actually experiencing. Are they encountering errors either in the browser, in your React code, or on the server, in your Node or your Ruby code? Are there any performance issues that are sort of slowing down your API? Is it database calls? Is it external APIs? What's actually making things slow? How are your servers doing? Are they almost out of memory? Is their disk filling up, etc.? But then you can take all of this information and customize it into different dashboards, change the time frame that you're looking at, and then set up anomalies. So say you have an endpoint that typically responds in 200 milliseconds. If it suddenly bumps up to 2 seconds, you get notified via email or Slack or whatever you set up. So thanks to AppSignal, head on over to their website at appsignal.com and you can try them out for 1 month for free. And if you use the code LEIGH, that's Lee, you get 10% off for the full year. Thank you. So with this in place, now we'll get some extra information and hints from TypeScript about the data we have access to. So we're going to start by adding our first input field. We'll put it in a div to sort of make sure each one's on its own line, and we'll add a label. So HTML4, this will be for the name field, and name like that. And then we below put the actual input itself. So we'll say input type of text. I always want to say string, but it's text. Name is name. We can give it an ID too if we'd like. Name. And now is where we tie this input into our useForm hook. So you do that by applying a ref. And the ref that you add is a call to the register function. So this is the function that ties the two together. So if we were to save this and go take a look here, we've already got this working with our single field. So we'll just go and add in the additional input fields. So we've got name done. We'll have one for email, password, and then terms below. So this one becomes, change that, and that to the email. Oh man, some more work than I wanted. Okay, basically I had to type everything again. So we've got our email field here. Perfect. Next will be our password. I'm just going to type it because it seems to be quicker. Password, type of password, name and ID of password. Good to go. So last one will be the terms itself. So this will be terms. You must agree to our terms. Type would be a checkbox. Name is terms, ID is terms, and we registered as well. It's not the most beautiful form in the world, but it is what it is. So last thing, we need a way to submit this form to the server. So we add a div and we'll put a button in here. This is register. And we want to give this button a type of submit. Otherwise, it doesn't do anything. For example, if we put a type of button, you can click it all day long and it doesn't actually do anything. So you want a type of submit to basically tie it in to the form that it's supposed to submit. So next thing is how to handle form submission and get access to the data that the user has entered. So we'll come up to form, and this is where we add an onSubmit event listener. And normally you'd put here and you'd have your event in here and you can prevent default and all of that good stuff. But what you do with useForm is you use a function that they give you called handle submit. And handle submit is passed a function. And this function receives the form data like that. And because I've added the types, this is the nice part. You can say form data dot, and you get access to all of the different attributes that you defined in the interface. So why don't we just console.log this out so we can take a look at what we're dealing with. Pop back to the browser. So let's say name is Lee, email is email@email.com, and we'll just hit submit. So here is our object. We've got name, email, password, terms is false. So if we were to check this, submit, now we can see terms is true so that it's handling the Boolean as expected. I actually wasn't sure about that. I just took a guess. I'm glad it's right. And we're ready to move on to the next stage, which is validation. So I'm going to do validation before actually submitting this data to the server. And the cool thing is it actually only calls this function here if your data is correct. So you don't need to put like an extra check in here that it's if it's valid or not. It will handle all that for you. So the way you add validations, there's actually a few approaches you can take. If you're used to working with libraries like Yup, for example, I forget what the other ones are called. I don't know where to find it. But there's Yup, for example, and there's two other main validation libraries that React Hook Form supports. So you can use them if you'd like, but you can also just easily add your own validations. So why don't we just say for register, this one's required, or sorry, for name, this one's required. And we can add either true or we can put a string, which is what message, error message we should display to the user. So we'll do the same for email. Required is required. We'll come down here to password. This one's required as well. And then we'll require you to agree to the terms. So we can say required, you must agree to terms, like this. So now, if I were to submit this form, see it's not letting me because the password's a required field, and it's actually giving it focus, which is really cool. But we would want to display a message when the user has errors they need to deal with. So the way you do that is by grabbing the errors object. And errors, if we just want to take a look at what it looks like, console.log errors, like that. So if we try to submit, it's also an object where each property is our field, and then which validation caused it to trip up, plus the message you want to display to the user. So you can use those pieces of information to display a message, and we'll just put this below and we'll say if errors.name exists, so if there's an error on the name field, we'll put it in a div like this, otherwise null because there's no error to display. So this can just be errors.name.message, and that will show the error. So we'll just go and repeat this for all the different fields. So this one's email, password, and this is the terms. So with that in place, if we were to, well, it's already showing actually, which is pretty nice. Required is showing up below. So this is where you could go and add a class of error to it and make it red so that it stands out to the user. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to leave it like that. I wanted to add a couple more complex validations on the password field specifically. So I want to add a min length to try to promote to our users to use strong passwords. So we can say min length, and we can say that we want a value of 8, that's the minimum, and a message of must be 8 cars, like this. So now if you were to pop back here, fill in a few characters, it shows us that it must be 8 cars long. If you have no characters, it shows the first validation. So I mentioned you can use yup and the other validation libraries, but you might as well just start with the ones that React Hook Form give you because they're pretty easy to get up and running. But I want to add a more complex one. I want to require that our password has a lowercase character, uppercase, a number, and a special character. To do that, I will implement a validate property which receives a function with the value of what the user's entered. And then it's our job to basically return true if it's all checked out, or false if it doesn't. But instead of false, we can actually return a string, which is the message to display to the user. So I'm going to take an approach where we're going to be using everyone's best friend, regular expressions, but it's actually pretty easy in this case. So we're going to define an array of regular expressions, and we're going to require that all of them are true in order for this field to validate correctly. So our first one will be the characters A to Z. So we're going to require that to be there. Second one will be uppercase characters. Third one will be numbers, not dash, like that. And the last one will be a special character. So how do you do a special character? You can basically say if it's not any of the other ones. So we'll do that by defining a character range, I think it's called, I forget. And you put the caret here to signify not. So you say not A to Z or big A to Z or 0 to 9. And this is basically you want a special character, something that's not that. So then we'll use the every array iteration function that basically loops over all of them, and it's only true if every one of them is true. So this receives a function, and to our function is passed, in this case, each of the patterns that it's iterating over. And we will return a true or false to test whether the pattern is true or not. So we'll say pattern.test, and we'll test it against the input value here. And I want to return the result of this. So if we were to leave it like this, it will basically return true if every one of these is true. But instead what we can do is when it's false, we can return a string for what to display to the user. So must include lower, upper, number, and special character cars, we'll say. So just like that. So now if I go back here, we can start typing out, and once we're past 8 characters, it now uses our validate function. And if we were to add in, say, an upper, a number, and a special character, it checks out. It's good to go now. So at this point, why don't we add in submitting this information to the server? Because we have all of our validations in place. So we will do that by coming in, filling in the onSubmit. And I don't want to fill out this form data every single time, so I'm actually just going to pass some default values in here to sort of shortcut. So in this case, if you were building a form where you're sort of loading information for the user to edit that's saved in your database or whatever, you can use default values to fill in the initial value here. But I'm going to hard code it. So we'll say name is Lee, email is lee@email.com, why not? Password, we need to make it secure, so big P, special character, lower with a number over 8. There we go. And terms we'll say is true. So if we come back here now, just refresh the page, everything's sort of defaulted out, and I don't have to fill it in every time, which is very nice to deal with. So I'm just going to remove this console.log. It's not needed. So if we were to come here and click submit, it's submitting it, and this is where we're going to post our data to the server. So the first thing I want to do is basically know when it's making the request and it hasn't received a response yet. So when it's in a state of submitting. So we'll do that by defining some state here. So const submitting set submitting is equal to use state of type Boolean, which defaults to a value of false. And what we can do in here is we can say set submitting to true, and then after we're done submitting, set it back to false. So why would you do that? Well, now you can take this state here and apply it to your button to disable it when it's submitting. So it's disabled when submitting, like that. So if the server takes a couple seconds to respond, the button will be grayed out and the user can't submit this more times than we want. We could also add a check here too, like if it's already submitting, return false or something to avoid it from sort of going down here, but we'll just leave it like this. So this is where we're going to post to our server. And we are going to say const response is await fetch. And because we're awaiting, we need to make this function async. And where are we going to post our data to? We're going to post it to API auth. So API auth is another page I set up in Next.js, the API server-side pages that Next supports to have full stack apps inside of Next. And I'll just give you a quick tour of what this does. We've defined our interface plus a reCAPTCHA token that I'll be covering in another video. Basically how to use reCAPTCHA v2 both on the client in React and on the server, but for now we're going to ignore it. So Next requires you to export a function that receives the incoming request information and responds with some sort of response. So what we're doing here is we're accessing the form data submitted by the user. We're going to call a validate data, which right now it basically just checks if an email is in a hard-coded array of emails. So this is where you'd implement a database that checks if the user actually exists and sort of more complicated validation. And you might implement yup here on the back end as well. But we've sort of got it easy. And if it responds with errors in the errors array, we will respond with a 400. Otherwise, we'll respond with a 201 HTTP status code, which means created, all good, with a message of success. So this is where we're posting our data to. And post is the keyword. If I were to leave it like this, it would make a GET request. I need to switch fetch to use a post. So I say method post. What type of data are we posting? We are using headers to define that. And it is content type of application JSON. And what data are we actually posting? So we do that in the body using json.stringify. So here's where we'll pass up our form data. So I could just pass it up sort of form data as is, but because later in another video I'll be adding in a token and whatnot, I'm just going to do it sort of one by one, pass it up. So the name is formdata.name. The email is formdata.email. The password is formdata.password. And then we've got the terms is formdata.terms. So we're passing it up. We're getting our response back. And we want to convert that response into data. So we say const data is await response.json. And why don't we just look at what data is returned? So we'll console.log this data. We'll say server data is what we're getting back. And we will take a look. So for now, why don't I remove this other console.log so we just have one at a time. We'll come up here, we'll submit it, and we get back from the server success. And that's all good. So here you might in JavaScript redirect to a new page because you know that the user's created. Hopefully it responds with like an auth token or a cookie or something like that so that the user's logged in. But in this case, we're just going to leave this as is, and let's handle the error state right now. So what happens if we send up an email that already exists? So in my hard-coded array, used@email.com has already existed. So we'll just change this to say used@email.com. Refresh. So now I get back an array of errors with this error message. So this is obviously something you could never do on the front end because you don't have access to the database of users that exists in the system. Only the back end does. So it's telling us that there's an issue and we have to deal with it. But how do we display this error? Where are we storing the server-side errors? We're going to create some additional state for that. So we'll call it server errors. Set server errors. And this is state. And it will start off as an empty array because there's no errors yet. But let's define what type it is. So this is an array of strings, just like that. So now what we can do is basically, prior to submitting to the server each time, we will set server errors to be fresh, nothing in there. And then once we get a response back, let's add an if statement. So if data.errors exists, then what we will do is we will set server errors to be data.errors, like this. So we could add an else. This is the success, and we can basically say, we'll just console.log success redirect to home page. This is what you might do once the user logs in. So we save this, we come back here, we submit, but I'm not displaying it yet anywhere. If we were to sort of hop into components, look at our, where does this state live? React overlay, home, there we go. So if we look at our hooks here, we can see in our state email already used, and we just need to display this to the user now. So we'll do that maybe at the top of the form, and we'll say if server errors, if that's true, we will put a UL, and inside of the UL we'll iterate over each of the errors. So server errors dot map, an error will be displayed in an LI, and we need a key because we're returning an array of these LIs. So key can just be the error message itself. We need to handle when there are no errors. So there's two ways of doing conditionals. I used a ternary here. You could do the trick where you do the and then you can get rid of the second part of the ternary. Both work, it's up to you, whatever you prefer. This approach causes some issues, I think, in React Native because they don't want false being rendered out. They want something or null. So I tend to use ternary, but short circuit is pretty cool too. So if we click register, we update our state with the errors that the server gave back to us, and we can show email already used. So with this, our form is basically done, but why don't we add some tests? And there's a lot of things you could test about this form. You could test to make sure it's submitting to the server correctly, which means you'd have to mock out the request to the server, mock fetch out. And I've got a whole nother video on how to mock fetch inside of your tests. That's a little bit more than I want to get into now. So why don't we add some validations to make sure that it shows the correct error message when there's some invalid data on the screen. So that's the test we'll be adding. We'll add two, one when it must be 8 characters and another when it must include all of these special ones. With our form the way it is, it's time to hop in and start writing some tests to make sure that it's validating our input and displaying the errors correctly to the user. So I've got this index.test.tsx file inside of pages, but in an __ test file, just to separate it out from the main ones. And I've already imported the different React testing library functions that we're going to need. We may or may not need this act function that sometimes causes me some issues. We will see. I've got these jest DOM imports that help when we're writing the expects functions, and then I've imported our component itself. So the first thing that we want to do is render out our component. So we do that by calling the render function and passing in our home component. And this gives us back a bunch of different functions that we can call to find different elements on the page. So the first one that we want is find by label text, and that will allow us to find the input by its label text. Next will be find by text. We're going to use this to help us find the error message on the screen. And the last one is find by role, which will help us find the button to actually submit the form, which is when a lot of the validations run from React Hook form. So with this in place, we'll try to find our input. So const input equals await find by label text, and we will be finding it based on the label password. So why don't we start this thing up by opening our terminal and running yarn test. And things are passing, which is awesome, but we haven't tested anything out, so that might be why. So the first test we want to write is basically that it displays the validation error, but it won't do that until we've entered some text and then actually submitted the form. So we're going to use this fire event function to fire the input. I think you could do change as well event on the input variable. And what data are we going to pass to the event? We'll pass the target value of whatever the user has entered. So that's the user input. Next, we want to fire the submit event, and we'll fire it on the button. So instead of putting the button in a variable, I'll just do it right here. So await find by role, we'll find the button, and that should submit it. And then we'll just wait for that to see. See, I got this act. An update to home inside a test was not wrapped in act. When testing, code that causes React state updates should be wrapped into act. So that's fine, we'll deal with it. So we've got act here. So we'll take act and we'll wrap it around our code. So we'll just put these inside. And because we're waiting in here, we need to make this async. And if we were to run it again, I think it's still going to give us an error. You called act async without await. So when you've got async in here, you want to await act to finish up. And with that in place, our tests are passing again. So now we can come here below. We'll try to find the error on the page. So we'll put it into a variable called error, and we'll use find by text. And this one's validating the length. And what was the error message when the length is small? Must be 8 chars. So that's the text we'll try to find on the page. And this is async because it doesn't happen sort of right away. It needs like a re-render and stuff like that. And once we get to here, we can basically write and expect that this error is in the document. So expect error to be in the document. And so where does this function come from? Because it's not part of Jest itself. It comes via this import here from testing library jest DOM. It provides some sort of extra expect functions that are nice to work with. So with this in place, the test still passes, which means it found it correctly. The funny thing is, sometimes you can actually just comment out this act and it somehow works. So this is a mystery to me. I have no clue what act does or what causes it, but I guess it's fine to leave in, like it didn't cause any problems, right? So let's just go with the flow. If anyone has like a surefire way of why it appeared and why it didn't cause issues when I commented it out, I would love to hear. So next test is basically the same thing. So I'm just going to copy and paste. But instead of must be 8 characters, we wanted to test when it's over 8 characters, so A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, something. But when it doesn't include that error message, which we'll see here, must include lower, upper, number, and special chars. So you could copy this whole thing, but you can actually use regex. So you could just say when the text contains like a part of it, so you don't have to look for the whole thing. And with this in place, hopefully this second test passes, and it does. So there we go. We've written a couple tests that find the input fields, enter some data into it, trigger the validation by trying to submit the form with invalid data, and then we look to see that the error message is displayed to the user. So that's all I wanted to cover for today. We've basically built out a functioning yet somewhat ugly user registration form that sends the data to the backend, shows the backend errors, does client-side validation, and we've tested to make sure that validations are showing up correctly. Hope you enjoyed the video. Tune in for a video on reCAPTCHA. We're going to add it to the front end and the back end to validate that it's a human and not a robot playing with our form. Have a good day. Take care. Bye.